This is somewhat of a response to one of Dorian Stretton's videos, and this is a good response to the current um, religion as a mental illness argument. That's an argument that gets put forth primarily by Live Life 8072, but Emendum also discusses it, and he also does say that. And he says that well, Gary says that when we have belief in a sky daddy, then the function is then the function is broken. We are broken when we you know when we when we don't use logic, of course. Now, I have had a lot of things to say about that, of course, because of the fact that there are scientific arguments, such as fine tuning, which are not so much arguments for the fact that there is a God, but the fact that it is probably more likely, or it's more likely under these facts that there is a God. Now I have a full video on what Robin Collins says about fine tuning, but and I have other videos where I discuss it as well. But I want to discuss what Stretton says here. What Stretton says, he responds to it by talking about how we have all thought abstractly, and that religion, science, and art come from the same mother, but the mother is thinking abstractly. Excuse me. How the when we think abstractly, when we think about how did this come about, how did that come about, all this stuff. When we think abstractly about things, now I'm gonna put a link to the video, as I think it's a great video, but essentially, he says religion, science, and art come from the thinking from the abstract thought of us. And when we think about how did this come about or how did that come about, some of us think about science. We think about a certain cosmology and such, and cosmology and such, explain this, and that. And then others of us come up with certain religious thought as ways to explain that. And that kind of has made me thought about how there are some of us who happen to seek God out, who happen to seek God's footprints, or God's marks in the world, or things God has done that like if you read various articles of the teleological argument for the existence of God, and in my opinion, that the teleological argument is the best one, and I don't have a lot of faith in the ontological one, nor do I like the cosmological that much, but the teleological, that has a lot of promise. Robin Collins, the whole fine tuning thing, that falls into the teleological one. And when we look for God, we see things that the teleological argument says. We see order, or we see beauty, or stuff like that. That will say, what, this didn't happen by accident. This is well, it's quite possible, if not likely, that because of this fine tuning, that someone probably set the dial, or hit the very small target. That when we look for that, when we look around, when we look in the world looking for some kind of God's footprints, or something like that, it's very possible that we find that. And I'm not saying that everybody who looks for it, who looks for God's footprints, find it. They don't always find them. There are atheists that have often looked for them, but maybe they were subconsciously not open to the possibility because of preconceived bias or whatever. But I think that those of us who looked for religion or looked for God, and thus that bred religion, those of us who have looked for God in the world, looked for His footprints, and thus looked for Him, it's very possible that that the people who did end up religious, they ended up religious because of what they found or because of what they saw. You know, I think that even though the Bible says a lot of things. It does. It says that that all these people saw God. And stuff like that. That Moses saw God, or Moses saw God, and all these prophets saw God. Or they see this cloud, or some bad things happen because people sin, or something like that. But then there are also all these people following Christ's death, or also maybe before that, who saw nothing of the sort, who were looking for it, and some found it, some didn't. And this is as Dorian Stretton says, this is a result of thinking abstractly, because we haven't seen anything. The people who are talked about in the Bible, the prophets and Moses and Adam and Eve and such, and Noah, all saw God in one form, in one empirical form or another. Well, not all of them, but most of them in the Old Testament anyway. They mostly saw God, but then there was a big chunk of people who didn't see God empirically, so they think abstractly, and they think about what is this, what's that, where does that come from, what is this, what is this about, and those of us who find God end up in religion, and those of us who don't end up in atheism or agnosticism or whatever, or antitheism or whatever. Anyway, what I'm thinking though is that this is a airtight argument for the fact that because we think religiously, or we are religious, this very well means that it's not a true thing to say that those of us who believe in God are mentally ill. I don't think that's a fair statement, because it does all come, religion and science all come from abstract thought. It all comes from that. So it's not correct to say that those who come to one conclusion are delusional and mentally ill, and those who come to the other are not. And it's quite possible that one group was doing this abstract thought without preconceived bias, and the other one wasn't, or both of them were. So I think that they both, the people who end up looking at science, and the people who end up looking at God and religion, just are from the same thing, but they just end up moving towards different conclusions, and ending up towards different conclusions on the same matter. If it were the case that if we think about where did, or how did event X occur, if we think about that, and some people say one thing and others say another, the people who say the one thing can't say that the other group who say another are delusional. It's kind of, I mean, and I think that a lot of that comes from a lot of this argument for religious, people who are religious and delusional. I think a lot of it comes from a lot of dumb things that theists do, and a lot of dumb things that Christians do in particular. But I think that because of what is said here, what about how religion and science and art come from abstract thought, I think that it has been shown thoroughly that they all come from the exact same thing. And it's just one people think one thing, and another think differently. Religion and science come from the very function of thought. It comes from the very function of rational abstract thought. And some of those people are going to see God's footprints in the world, and others won't. That's just the way it is on every dichotomy in the world. Some people are going to see, and also it's hard to say that atheism and theism is a dichotomy. Go watch Fred's Conference Reports videos. Go watch his videos and get a good discussion of why belief and non-belief are not dichotomies. But it's just I think that this thoroughly states that that there's no real way that just believing in God can be delusional, because it comes from real function. It comes from function. It comes from function of rational thought, of thinking abstractly. So that kind of, and it just kind of happens, that I don't think that if someone was really mentally ill, that they would be thinking abstractly anyway. People who are mentally ill, don't do well with rational thought, and abstract thinking is rational thought. So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts.